So you got to surround yourself with smart people that know what they're talking about. I mean, look, I'm at the point where I don't have nothing left to prove, and I can ask the stupid questions now without people thinking I'm really stupid. And I remember actually, I remember a commander in the Navy once said that, ask the smart people. He said, you'll be surprised how dumb they really are. You know, and that's kind of like a true respect.
Technology is transforming how we think, how we lead, and how we win. From InterVision, this is Status Go, the show helping IT leaders move beyond the status quo, master their craft, and propel their IT vision.
Penetration testing, or pen testing for short, is one of the unsung heroes in the battle against cyber attacks. Sometimes it's just a check-the-box exercise, yet it can be one of the most valuable tools in your efforts to identify and protect your data. That is why, as a former CIO myself, I was interested to learn about the evolution of pen testing. Welcome to Status Go. I'm your host, Jeff Tunn. The fight against cyber threats is never ending. Just ask our guest today, Darren Manners. He has been on the front lines of the battle for decades. Darren is the founder and developer of Red Spy 365. Red Spy 365 is a unique weapon in this war against threat actors. I had the opportunity to moderate a webinar with Darren a few weeks ago, and I wanted to take a deeper dive into Red Spy 365 and its story. Let me get this disclaimer out of the way early. Red Spy 365 is a valued partner of InterVision. We are going to geek out about this product a bit more than we typically do on Status Go. With that, Darren, welcome to Status Go.
Yes, I appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me.
You may have caught a hint of an accent from Darren.
Sure.
Darren, could you share a bit about your background and your time in now His Majesty's Royal Navy?
Yeah, it's changed, isn't it? So, as a young 19-year-old lad, I dropped out of university and joined the Royal Navy. I joined as what we used to call a communication technician back in those days. In fact, it was called a communication technician because we couldn't tell anybody what we did. Now they actually call us cryptologic technicians. They've actually come out and say what we did. But my job was to intercept, analyze, and disseminate enemy communications to command tactically and strategically. It was quite an intense one. I'd done 9 years in there and left as a chief petty officer. When I left, it was kind of the wild west of internet. You know, those are the days when you had the webmasters. But my job was always offensive and defensive security. I really moved in that realm, basically from when I was 19, physical security, or whether it be, sort of understanding cryptography. But it really was, it moved from 19 to where I am now, 50. So I've been on the blue side, like the defensive side. But majority of the time now, especially later in my career, I've been on the offensive side of things, the red side, as it were.
And you've got certifications in both sides, though, right?
Yeah. People say to me, like, you have a lot of certifications, and I always try and point out, it's just that I enjoy what I do. And so one of the things that certifications, they do for me anyway, is they focus me probably in areas that if I was reading a book, I'd just flip through. So it's important, I think, to understand some of the more boring aspects of security. But again, they focus me, but I kind of like the ones as well where it's hands-on in front of my peers. Mm-hmm. And I've never been afraid to fail, so I always tell people, look, I've failed more than I've passed. So I'm never the smartest person in the room, but I'm pretty persistent in what I do. I love to learn. And, let's face it, especially in our industry, and that's really kind of a tech as a whole, it changes all the time. You think how far it's changed from the days of like Windows 3.5.1 to where we are now. If you didn't like technology or learning, it's not like, I always say English teachers probably have a slightly easier job because there's no going to be Shakespeare 2.0 dropping tomorrow in which everything has changed and now they've got to relearn everything. Right. So yeah, my accent is, I'm from North London. I was born and raised in London. I moved over here about 20 years ago. I never lost my accent. And I always tell people in the accent scheme of things, I'm the downstairs of Downton Abbey as opposed to the upstairs of Downton Abbey. I think a lot of people are familiar with, an upper class British accent from sort of Hugh Grant and some of the movies.
Yep.
But really, actually, going back, I think it was some of the movies. Remember War Games and Hackers, and
Absolutely.
those were the things that really got me into it. And it got me into that tech side of things, the understanding. And then when I joined the Navy, it kind of developed through that. It actually made me much more disciplined. I definitely give the Navy the credit for disciplining me in teaching me how to learn. I came from sort of inner city, middle and high school, and not much expectation out of the pupils in those things. They never really taught you how to learn. They said this is what you got to learn, but they never taught you how. When I got to the Navy, 50% of my class was female, which is, something that, the industry lacks anyway at the best of
Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
But the girls that was in my class, I was always amazed at how they were really good at rote memorization, or how they were really good at understanding it. But they taught me that, how to learn nomenclatures and, rhymes and making things up to remember, large lists or just different things. And because I always felt like that was cheating. I always felt like I just had to read something and it kind of just stay in the brain somehow. But when I started to understand that's how learning was, that's really kind of really enabled me to grasp some other aspects as well. And we went from learning the atom, I remember, to learning sort of baseband satellite type intercept, much more
Yeah. Yeah.
sophisticated. And then when I left, the certifications focused me very narrowly on the blue side, the red side. I've done the SANS GSE, CCIE security. I always just aimed at the ones that I think as well. If I failed them, I was like, I don't feel too bad. This is a really super hard exam.
Yeah.
But I always tell people some of the hardest exams I ever did were the ones I did really early on, like the basic ones, just because, it's new. You don't really know what to expect in the industry. And so sometimes, you end up with especially the basic ones, it's like a trivial pursuit of the last 20 years of security. Whereas at least some of the more complex ones that you think are a lot harder, they're very narrowly focused. So you're allowed to go deep, but, a mile deep, but an inch wide, which is a lot better, I think, at times.
Well, let's shift a little bit here to penetration testing. For our listeners who may not know exactly what pen testing is, can you describe pen test, what you do during a pen test?
Sure. So the aim is to mimic, the bad actors. But, what you're trying to do is to test the defenses that an organization have. So you're trying to make sure that they're the onion and not the egg, so that if you get one past one defense, that the whole thing doesn't fall down. But you're mimicking the bad actors. You're exploiting vulnerabilities, mistakes, misconfigurations, which leads back to sometimes you have to know how things are configured to understand how they're misconfigured. Sometimes that's a miss. But really, penetration testing is is ethical hacking. It's trying to mimic the bad actors, but it's evolved. It's not what it used to be. Basically, back in the day, you could pretty much, it was like the Wild West. You can go back 10 years and it was like the Wild West. But nowadays it's more, I would say it's got a better framework in it, like
Mm-hmm.
PTaaS framework, open source frameworks, that we try and follow a repeatable process so that if the next pen tester comes along, he can look at my report and understand what I'm doing. And it is
Right.
evidence based as well. You're not just making it up. I always tell people, a vulnerability scan is kind of like jiggling the door. It says, hey, this is potentially a problem, but really a pen test tests it to see if it really is a
It is.
problem. But
Yeah.
it then goes beyond that door to see if there's other doors that it can go through. And of course, pen testing is like external, internal, web applications, social engineering, physical. You've seen the evolution from pen testing into red teaming, where
Mhm.
you're not just trying to do a shotgun approach of see how many ways you can get into an organization, but in red teaming, you're trying to find one way in undetected. So you're testing, the response of the organization as well.
And then this other evolution that caught my attention when we did the webinar was this concept of continuous pen testing. Talk to us a little bit about that concept.
So I would say about nine years ago, I started working on a product, and I've worked on a number of different products, sort of Cyber Warfare Defense League, which is a tongue-in-cheek, IR system. I worked with Sphere of Influence, Radius CP. But what I started to see was that, I'd done a test, and then 2 weeks later, this organization was compromised. And I was like, we suck, because 2 weeks ago
Yeah.
they were fine. Now they don't, not fine. And so I started to understand that we had to do better as a pen tester. There was a lack of skin in the game. I could go do a test and leave, and then that's it. My weekends. If you think about it, before Red Spy, I had zero skin in it. Every weekend off, I wasn't responsible for anything. I could go in, do test, leave, go do my training. No responsibilities. I wasn't responsible for like a sysadmin where you're on call or instant response. Very easy. But what I understood was that you had to move from a photograph to a movie. We had to be able to adjust and
Mhm.
adapt so that as the threat landscape changes, and there used to be the mantra of if you change your infrastructure, you should always retest. Well, to be honest, you don't have to change anything. I mean, the world around you changes fast enough.
Right.
So I understood that things were moving in a way that we could test. And what I mean by that is back about 10 years ago, if there was a problem, if you started doing heavy scans, systems would fall over. And the error handling of a lot of, infrastructure devices or a lot of systems wasn't that great. And so, the one-off testing was okay because they could put up with you maybe forcing a reset on something or reboot on something. But I noticed that things were getting more resilient. At the same time, I started to see, I think Raphael was doing a talk, Rise of the Red Team, which was like a DARPA funded project with Cortana. So I started understanding some Cortana scripting. I was working on ISOL, which is the email phishing side of things. I was talking IRC, Raphael was talking to IRC. So at that point, I went back to the room and started, playing with some of the Cortana scripts and seeing how that could implement with my ISOL system and the IRC I was building. I was like, wow, I could actually move this from the photograph to the movie. And that's
Mhm.
really kind of 1.0.
Yeah.
That was really the emergence of it.
I love that analogy of a photograph in the movie because that really jumps out at you when you're talking about that. Now, the third definition that I'd love you to hit on, and then we'll dive deeper into Red Spy, is PTaaS, or penetration testing as a service. Now, what is that?
There's been a number. So I've been like when I first started doing this, no one was doing continuous testing. No one even mentioned continuous testing. And I used to do a lot of Google searches. Maybe my searches weren't great, but no one was doing anything 10 years ago. And then you started to see that, the emergence of PTaaS, which, pen testing as a service. And a lot of that was just, you know, people understood that they needed to test more on a regular
Mhm.
basis. And it's not continuous, but what it does is it's like maybe once every 2 months or once a month or twice a year or 3 times a year. So now, they're saying, okay, because if you imagine, especially as a pen tester, towards any end of budget year or towards the end of any sort of calendar year, everybody's trying to cram in pen testing because they have like
Mhm.
a regulatory compliance requirement that says you've got to test once a year. And so everybody wants that test that they've sort of put off, done now. And so there's kind of like spikes towards, budgetary years, maybe at the beginning of a year or sorry, towards the end of a year, that time is busy. And then of course you've got lull periods. No one likes testing over Christmas. No one likes, testing over Thanksgiving or, coming up towards the end of the year in Christmas time or so you've got these kind of like peaks and troughs. And I think what pen testing as a service does, it kind of ironed it out. And it does help on the back end where you can start sort of managing your teams or managing, organizations so they can test regularly and you can sort of
Mhm.
iron out bumps and peaks and troughs, as it were. But to me, I was always like, well, that's just, one off. In fact, Rob Joyce, the head of the NSA tailored access operations, came out and he said, these guys are coming at you 24/7, 365, and you've got to think accordingly. And so what I did was I thought about it. I was like, man, you got to be able to think about this accordingly. You got to be able to test like the bad guys are testing at you, continuously, and be
Mhm.
the known bad, as it were. So that's kind of one tick box that you get out of it. But that he was talking about continuous. He was talking about to me anyway, it came across as it was a continuous effort.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I started to work out, okay, well, how could we do this continuously, not just as a once a month or but as a continuous service, so that as temporary cracks, mistakes, misconfigurations can be found, we can highlight them and provide the actionable intelligence when it's needed the most, i.e., when you first see it, when as soon
Yeah.
as it's seen. So if you go back to my Navy days, that was all about actionable intelligence, providing the command of actionable intelligence. So not a lot has changed. I'm in pen
Mhm.
tester, but my job is still to provide that actionable intelligence, to give the command the information that they need so that they can digest it and make it so that they can make decisions or command decisions based upon what we say.
Well, let's talk specifically about Red Spy 365. When you talked a little bit about when that idea was born, but when did you make the decision to productize it? And then let's dive into what is it? What do you get with Red Spy 365?
So what I wanted to do was, I never wanted to be the next vulnerability or create my own vulnerability scanner or create my own web application scanner or create my own X tool, because I understood that I don't have a massive development team. When you're building something, you don't have a massive development team. And to be honest, I didn't want to carry that development technical debt forward either, because good web application software creators are hard to find. It's a very niche field. So what I relied upon was, when I first started Red Spy, I knew that it was going to be best of breed tools. So when people say to me, how many developers do you have on Red Spy? It's like, well, hundreds if you look at the products that are combined inside it,
Hmm.
because each of the best of breed product does their own thing. They've got their own niche, and they've got, some of them have got decades of experience understanding that. So I was never going to go, hey, I know what, I'm just going to create my new, vulnerability scanner. There was just no need for that, for a start. And secondly, I don't think it would have been best for the client, the best for the customer. So that's kind of like, Red Spy's best of breed tooling, bots, and I talk about a bot is, a bot to me is an event action trigger inside of Red Spy. And I really wanted to create it low code, no code. I was tired of hearing, gotta be a ninja. And I'm like, yeah, there's a place for ninjas, I think, in the security field, but you don't want them right at the customer client facing. At least I don't think so, especially if they're like ninjas in tooling. You need them be able to be at much higher levels so they have a bigger impact, or all the agencies under your testing control. So the idea there is that, it's best of breed plus the tooling, but then the last thing is the analyst. So I always talk about bots and tooling does that repetitive tasks brilliantly. It's
Hmm.
going to do a repetitive task much better than a human can do. Whereas, a human is very good at interpretive aspects, especially when we talk about AI or ML. I say I have AI. I've got AI in there with, or we've got machine learning in there with the policies and procedures that we're putting in. But we also want the human aspect to understand it and look at it. And that really comes to the forefront. So the idea was that Red Spy would understand that there's a change in the risk posture, and then bring that to the attention of the pen tester to say, okay, what do we do with this?
Hmm.
Now there may be some automated workflows that you can automatically put in, notifying the pen test, notifying the client, maybe doing some other enumeration. But really, I wanted to bring it to the attention and say, hey, something's changed. What do we need to do? And it may be something's changed on the client, or it may be something's changed in the big wide world. The other thing, so you have this nucleus of best of breed tools, bots, and analysts. And then the other thing I wanted to be able to do was understand that institutional knowledge is everything. And what I
Hmm.
mean by that is, as a pen tester, and when I do a one-off, I don't really know the organization. I don't know enough about, the institutional knowledge, what this asset means to the business that I'm testing. I might have a slight indication, but I really rely upon organizations understanding that institutional knowledge, when they digest that report. But what I found was that you could sort of feed in like business impact analysis, asset inventory, product tech catalogs, that you could feed in compliance, so that you can now start to understand, okay, we've got a risk, we've seen a change in risk on this asset, but how does that affect the business? And I think that's
Hmm.
the maturity that how Red Spy is evolving, so that we understand, okay, this is a critical risk on the coffee pot. Well, it's not going to be as a bigger risk to, a high risk on, say, something that, is sensitive to the organization. So you can start to understand, the prioritization. And then the other final part was I understood that we've got this institutional knowledge, that we've got this compliance where we can start to understand the root cause. Maybe we see a risk and there's a control object failure. We need to fix the control object so that we don't see the risk repeating itself again. The other part was the final part to me was understanding threat intelligence. And so I teamed up with Intel 471 so that we could start suck Intel, threat intelligence so that these risks that we see, we can start to understand what the bad guys are doing with them. So that
Hmm.
I'm not just mimicking other pen testers. That otherwise, you're just kind of like one big echo chamber. If you just look at what pen testers do and you can sign up to pen test websites and hopefully, you're mimicking the bad guys, but closed source threat intelligence based with best of breed tooling, bots, analysts, and also understanding the institutional knowledge as well as the compliance where the control object failures. To me, that's everything I needed to know about what priorities an organization should do, or the actionable intelligence I could provide to the organization.
When you go out and you work with client organizations, who's the who's the end user, if you will, of the Red Spy 365 tooling? Is it the CISO? Is it the security analyst? Who's actually getting in to that tool and making sure that they're taking care of the things they need to take care of?
Well, that's the exciting part of it. It kind of varies. But one of the things I looked at, especially very early on, we decided to split some roles up. So we had like the admin role, which was us, that's the analyst. Then you
Hmm.
had like a user role, just typical user role. Then you had a compliance role. Then you had a recommender role. And so you're trying to create the dashboard or the visibility for what they're interested in, like the CIO or what hat you wear, as it were. The
Hmm.
CIO hat is going to be more interested maybe in the compliance, the actual reporting, the metrics, the bigger picture. Whereas the security analyst might be the nuts and bolts of the technical findings, maybe mapped to some of the compliance. CFO might be interested in some of the metrics gathering so that at least they're heading in the right direction. So
Hmm.
to me, it was all about, what hat you wear to what you get out of the system. Because otherwise what happens is every person that logs in is going to be like, well, I want it to say X, or I want it to be, I want the dashboard to look like this, or you're always going to have some kind of differing opinion. In fact, I've always talked about putting widgets in the dashboard and people be able to build them. But really, it's the roles enabled me to be able to do a certain aspect of that. And then, as we move forward, the roadmap, as it were, for Red Spy, that starts to become much more interesting because now,
Hmm.
to me, content is king. And what I mean by content is a tactic, tool, technique, procedure, or a combination of. We need to be able to gather the latest and greatest, content, and we need to be able to put it into a format, if you imagine like a playbook, that Red
Hmm.
Spy can digest. And this is why we built the orchestrator, in Red Spy, so that we can extract, from, and initially right now it's from my analysts. My analysts can add new tools, tactics, techniques, procedures. They can add scenarios, phishing pages, landing pages. They can add that at a much higher level. Imagine it like an app store, and then make
Hmm.
that available to all the agencies under their control. So it's much like Apple, if you think about it. When Apple first released the iPhone, they didn't have the App Store. It was the iPhone. It was Apple engineers made the apps on the iPhone. So much like that's
Right.
where we are right now. We have it slightly decentralized. We've got our own app stores, but it's kind of like where we're at. The next stage for me is the marketplace, where we can now crowdsource that security research content and
Hmm.
make it so that people can put that content into that digestible format for Red Spy, and clients can purchase that content from the marketplace. If you think about it, typical crowdsourcing right now is 1,000 people attack this one IP address,
Hmm.
and you may get very similar answers because 1,000 people are attacking a single IP address with a certain, you know, uh, subset of risks and vulnerabilities that they're going to find. But what I'm interested in is asking those 1,000 people how they would attack that IP address and gaining that knowledge,
Yeah.
extracting that DNA from those 1,000 people, because now then the tool becomes a combination of multiple DNA. And
Yeah.
that's really the only way we're going to compete with nation state. Like I don't have the resource of nation state, but what we're seeing is that line become a little bit blurry because as sort of, global things happen, then, nation state actors may sort of blur the lines between criminal actors and may transfer tooling. And that has the effect of really sort of putting one criminal entity maybe above the
Yeah.
defense capabilities. And so we have to be able to mimic that in a sense. And I think the only way you can mimic that is by crowdsourced security
Crowdsourcing.
research, extracting that kind of data.
So you've talked a lot about the analyst. Are these employees of Red Spy? How does the analyst side of this work?
Yeah, so the analysts, usually have teams. So we have a team leader and a team member. So team members are usually responsible for the infrastructure and understanding everything else. They can get involved in some of the testing, but the team leader's sort of freed up to do the actual testing. And I think nearly all my guys are ex-military. We have over 100 years experience just in I think just in probably the military alone. But
Hmm.
we've got
Wow.
a number. My the way we try to set it up is semi-autonomous teams, but that way I can compete teams against each other. It can almost gamify that kind of process. Um, but there's a pathway from a junior to a senior. So we have like red teams, then we have gold teams. So obviously Red Spy has different versions. So we have a core which is external only, external, attack the threat surface web application as well as phishing. Then we have the core
Hmm.
plus where we can put an appliance internally and do the same thing internally. Whereas, so I have red teams that just focus on the external and the phishing side of things. And then we have gold teams that do what red teams do, but also do the internal side. And the numbers are quite, they start to vary sort of, what teams can handle. It's kind of like a gymnasium membership kind of thing. Some clients are
Hmm.
very involved. Some clients aren't so involved. Some clients are much bigger. Some clients are much smaller. But we try and balance it so that teams, we have key risk indicators so that should a team start to sort of feel like it's getting bigger, we can almost split that team in half, and that now we've got that team member can become a team leader of two teams, and
Yeah.
so you start to see them sort of bubble off. And the idea is as well that there's a career progression within Red Spy as well, so that they're not just, hey, I'm a pen tester, we're just banging on a target.
Yep. When we did the webinar, one of the slides that I just loved because I thought it was genius. You did a slide on lessons learned, but you had the word learned marked out, and you replaced it with learning. So, what are the lessons that you are still learning, Darren?
This goes back so that there's a I always believe we're always learning. This is a field that we are constantly learning. It's always something new. You've got to maintain. This is one of those fields where you're spending half your time sharpening an axe before you're cutting a tree down, because you just have to. It's a lot of
Hmm.
involvement. You have to have that passion for it. Otherwise, it kind of disappears very quickly. But definitely, one of the lessons I'm learning is all about the tooling. And I mean that in a sense that it's not just a press button tool. The difference is, though, the tooling can make things so much easier, but you still have to explain the complexity of what happened to the client so that they can, know what to fix or know how to defend against. But the tooling allows repetition. The tooling allows, I give an example. So if I come up you with off the shelf tooling that everybody knows about, your defensive capability is probably aware of those tools. So there's a lot of
Hmm.
aftermarket work that has to go on for me to avoid your defenses. Well, and I always go back to, I think it was Elon Musk that was talking about it's not the tool, or it's not the machine that builds the prototype, but it's the machine that builds the machines that build the prototype. And so really that's what I focus on. It's kind of like it's one thing to sort of be able to create a tool that does X, but you've got to create a tool that allows a combination of tools to be able to
Hmm.
build. So you got to, this is where that orchestrator comes into play. This is where you got to be able to orchestrate things and be able to digest things very, very diverse. So in learning that was like, something we understood very early on. I think, we wanted to make it so that it was low code, no code. Like I said, I was like, I didn't want ninjas. I think turning around and saying, look, if you're 250,000 security analysts short, you're not going to sort of get there by beating them over the head and saying you've got to be a ninja. You have to create the tooling for them. We could still, it'd be kind of like turning around and saying, hey, look, you know what? I think we should only use cannons. And it's like, no, we've got guns now. We can, do much better than just a cannon. Or we got artillery things. No, we got to. I remember back in the day when I first left the military and I was working in a web development team, and I was using Dreamweaver, and I was like a heretic for using Dreamweaver because everybody was building it in Notepad. It was like, oh my God, look how much code you've put in there. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm getting everything that you've done in like, a tenth of the time than what it's taken you to do it. Now we build websites in websites. That's how far that area's come. But offensive really never got into that. So to me, it's the tooling. The other part is to be, what I've learned is to surround myself with like super smart people. And I'm, like I said, I am never the smartest in the room, but I sit there and I listen to them, and I have to orientate myself to the language and what they're talking about. Right now it's, we're doing some things with some crypto, and understanding, Gnosis Safe, Diamond Database, and understanding that kind of language and how that works and how Pope works. And then you've got, the Kubernetes area. So, you've got to start to work out this evolving technology. So you've got to surround yourself with smart people that know what they're talking about. Don't BS. I mean, look, I'm at the point where I don't have nothing left to prove, and I can ask the stupid questions now without people thinking I'm really stupid.
Yeah.
That's. And I remember actually, I remember a commander in the Navy once said that. He turned around to me and he said, "Ask the smart people." He said, "You'll be surprised how dumb they really are." And that's kind of like a true respect. I mean, you're only smart for a very, like, if you ever write a white paper on something, and I've done some sans white papers, you only really get deep into the weeds when you're doing it. 3-4 months from then, you can't really remember a great deal. You're not sort of, at least me, I'm not at that level where I can sort of read a page and remember it for the rest of my life. I think I'm like everybody else. You peak, and it's the idea when you do certifications. You're peaking at that period, but you can never, unless you're doing it 24/7, you're never going to be maintaining that level. It's like athletes. You peak and trough. So to me, it was all about surrounding myself with smart people and letting them do their thing. And that's the other part is, one of the things I've learned is that I go through, I do it very differently. I think one of the things I learned was that you do it through, I'm a very visual person, but I can do that in my mind. I can sit there and work out interactions with something that I'm building and how it should look and what the results should be. And I go through the whole process, just to find, I'm like, it drives my wife crazy because, I'll sit there and I'll go through, like, if I'm going to wear what tomorrow, I'm going to go through the action. I'm going to get up, I'm going to brush my teeth. I've got toothpaste. So I'm going to need socks. I'm going to need underwear. I'm going to pants. I'm going to need shirt. When I'm packing, I'll go through that process. Like, I've already been there. That way I know what to pack. And it's the same with kind of web applications or anything I'm building. I go through the process, understanding, trying to find out what trouble things I'm coming up against. And then I'll sit about it and I'll think about it. And, I always think I can't remember who said it, but it was like, you got to have thinking time. If you don't have thinking time, you can't sit down and think about something. You're just reacting to things. So that's another lesson learned, just to be able to sit down and think. My wife would be like that. She'll say, well, stop thinking about it. I'm like, it's actually my thinking time. I'm just thinking about it. And it was interesting. When I first left high school, I'd done a job placement, like as a career thing for the school. And they sent me in to be in a lawyer's. And I realized that lawyers can charge thinking time. And I was like, wow, you can just, like, you can sit in a taxi and charge a client because you're thinking about them. They're like, yeah. I was like, that's pretty amazing. Like, you can just make stuff up. But obviously we don't charge thinking time, but I think that's part of it as well, that you're always constantly thinking. I'm one of these people that just constantly evolves. So I'm still learning. I always, I went to Black Hat, and there was this young kid that came up to me. When I say young, everything's young now. But he was like, yeah, anybody over 25 shouldn't be in security. And I was probably like, yeah, I probably agree, My brain's mush at times. But I said, I do have some background schemata I can remember, that maybe you need. And I think soft skills as well is important. But, it's interesting. Like, I always, again, if you ever think you're smart, go to somewhere like DEF CON. You'll see a 12-year-old kid kick your ass. I mean, it's just the
Hmm.
way it is.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
absolutely.
it's born of technology. It's kind of like they talk about SaaS products born off the cloud or cloud native. You got kids nowadays that are born of technology, know nothing different. When I was growing up, you still had to, hey, I'm going to phone you when I get there. So nowadays we're not without our tracking devices all the time with us now.
Yeah, we've evolved, we've learned. Well, Darren, we are out of time, man. Whenever you and I talk, the time just flies by. But before I let you go, I want to ask you one last question. Here on Status Go, we'd love to leave our listeners with a very intentional, explicit call to action. So, what are one or two things our listeners should go and do tomorrow because they listened to our conversation today?
So first thing, reduce your threat surface. If it doesn't need to be exposed, don't expose it. If you've got a port open that maybe only one person uses it, just restrict it to that one person. Threat surface exposure is always a bad thing. And the other thing is multi-factor authentication. Just if you're not doing multi-factor authentication now, you should be, because it's pretty simple to get a credential. And especially if now got VPN access and I can take that credential and reuse it to gain access to the organization. So
Mhm.
those two things. Definitely reduce the threat surface so that what you put out to the big wide world is the most restrictive possible. And then things like multi-factor authentication. I mean, there's a whole plethora of things that people can do. And people say to me,
Absolutely.
what's the most likely attack? It's like, depends on the skill set of the person attacking you, what they're going to do and what their TTPs are. But really, it's consistently over time. I would say it's kind of like, application whitelisting, threat surface reduction, XDR, EDR, and then sort of multi-factor authentication. It doesn't really change much.
Yeah. Well, that's excellent advice, and I would also encourage our listeners to check out Red Spy 365. As I mentioned, they're a great partner of Intervision's, and the platform that Darren has developed and launched into the world is a great tool to help you fight the cyber attacks coming your way. Darren, thank you so much for carving out time, man. I know how busy you are, and I appreciate you jumping on this call and chatting with us today.
Hey, no problem at all. I always say we're the best product you've never heard of. And hopefully, that will change. But I appreciate it. Thank you.
I hope so too, and I hope our listeners now will go check it out. To our listeners, if you have any more questions or you want to learn more, visit intervision.com. The show notes will provide links and contact information, and we'll be sure to link to Red Spy 365's website, and you can check them out. This is Jeff Tunn for Darren Manners. Thank you very much for listening.
You've been listening to the Status Go podcast. You can subscribe on iTunes or get more information at intervision.com. If you'd like to contribute to the conversation, find Intervision on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Thank you for listening. Until next time.